Hey folks, Dr. Mike Israetel here for Renaissance Periodization as always. First video of a 3-part series on preventing muscle loss during a cut, otherwise known as a fat loss phase. We're going to cover training, we are going to cover nutrition, and we're going to cover cardio. All three play an integral role in, first of all, most importantly, powering fat loss, of course, but also making sure that muscle loss is as small as possible, possibly non-existent. So today we'll talk about what you can do with your training, essentially the boxes you have to have checked in order to make sure you're doing anything reasonable in your training to set up the situation as best as possible to not lose muscle mass during your fat loss phase. So number one, you want to know what your maintenance volume is. Your maintenance volume on a cut is going to be higher because there's more catabolism to balance out some of that volume. So it's going to be more like your minimum effective volume on a mass phase or a maintenance phase. That's going to be your maintenance volume on a cut. If you're not familiar with this nomenclature or these definitions, tons of our other videos, specifically Hypertrophy Made Simple and Strength Training Made Simple, those series can really get you caught up. But in any case, basically you need to train enough. You also have to contend with the issue that as you progress into your cut, the level of total muscle burning catabolism goes up. So the minimum amount of volume you have to do for each muscle group probably trends upwards slightly as your cut progresses. All right. In serious cuts, your maintenance volume can get pretty close to or as high as your maximum recoverable volume, which means you're training as hard as you can possibly sustain in order to just barely keep your muscle, which of course we all know in hard cuts, gaining muscle usually isn't an option, and that's precisely the reason why. Now, not only do you have to, for the muscles you train at least at maintenance volume, make sure you're familiar with what your maintenance volume is, so on and so forth, but you have to understand that if you don't train certain muscles at maintenance volume, that is to say without enough volume or at all, they almost certainly will decrease in muscle size through the course of an incrementally more serious fat loss plan. For example, let's say that you were pretty good about training your calves on your recent mass phase, on your maintenance phase. Now the cutting phase comes up and you're like, I'm doing cardio, my workouts are long as it is. Forget about calves. You will lose your calves like a set of keys. They were here one day and where the hell are they now? Now, of course, they don't just decrease in size over a day, but over the course of 12 weeks or something like that of fat loss dieting, gee whiz, you gotta train them at least somewhat hard with at least some bit of volume so that they don't recede off your body. Doesn't it suck to build a muscle only to have it go away? For sure. Which also means no specialization routines on a cut. It has to be a general routine for every muscle, just enough volume to keep it on. Sometimes that means more whole body training. Sometimes that means a more advanced split, but you're not going to be trying to bring up your chest or your lats because that has to happen at the expense of not doing as much volume for other muscles. In almost every case in a fat loss phase, you want to train everything and train at least the amount that makes sure that your muscle doesn't fall off of your body. Number two, for the exercises you choose in your training, you have to make sure that your stimulus to fatigue ratios are on point. Okay, that means you want to choose the best exercises and the best techniques in them and the best rep ranges using those techniques in the exercises to maximize your stimulus and minimize your fatigue. Normally, you could just pick an amassing phase, really stimulative exercises like deadlifts, for example, that really fuck you up fatigue-wise, but they also stimulate so much muscle growth. And, that's the good part because you grow a ton of muscle in a mass phase. But the high fatigue they bring along isn't that big of a deal because when you're eating a ton and sleeping a ton and you're not cutting, your fatigue management is much easier. Fatigue just doesn't accumulate as much, so you can afford higher fatigue exercises. On a fat loss phase, fatigue is almost everything. And you have to make sure that in your training, you're keeping it as low as possible while keeping the stimulus as high as possible. So high stimulus to fatigue ratio exercises, techniques, and rep ranges are everything. And to that end, higher rep ranges often have better stimulus to fatigue ratios at the end of a cut for a variety of reasons we'll get into in another video. So sometimes they are a little bit better. Not wholly better, but if a lot of your training occurs in the 5 to 10 rep range during normal training, massing, or maintaining, in a fat loss plan, especially towards the end, you might want to take those exercises and move them into a 10 to 15 rep range. Just real quick preview of why your endurance tends to go up during cutting, but your leverages change to make you not as strong. And also, if you use the higher rep ranges, sometimes what can happen is you're essentially, as you continue through a cut, the leverage disadvantage makes you a little bit weaker, like your squats are deeper now. If you're using you're not doing high rep work, if you're doing low rep work, it can become psychologically really debilitating to have to like take weight off the bar or something like that. On the other hand, if you do higher reps and instead of increasing a lot of load, you increase reps during that time, you actually get so good at doing reps because your muscles become slightly more slow twitch on a cut that you may actually hit some pretty decent rep PRs. So even if these things are tied on a muscle retention perspective, which they probably close to are, you have a big psychological boost of just not sucking during the end of a cut. You can still hit PRs. You can still feel good about your training. And that's just for a month or so before the cut ends. When the mass phase starts up again, maintenance starts up again, you can go right back into the heavy stuff. Trust me, anything you lose is temporary, neural, you'll get it back super fast. Of course, in choosing high SFR exercise, we got to be mindful of exercises that, for the smallest amount of unit volume possible, just a few sets, give us a really good mind-muscle connection, high tension, high burn in the target muscle, a really good degree of pump, and plenty of disruption. You don't want to use a ton of exercises during your fat loss phase. Like, I think this is hitting the biceps, but I'm not sure, but I know I'm working hard and it's really tough. Tough is kind of a bad thing in a cut because fatigue is so impinged. You want exercises that for sure hit what you want. Like if you're doing curls, pick the kind of curl that you're like, oh my God, my biceps. And it's not as tough on your joints. It's not as tough on your systemic fatigue because again, you can't spare a lot of fatigue on a cut. This means, like sort of hinted at earlier, some of your highest raw stimulus magnitude exercises, the ones that whatever the fatigue is doing, they just grow the most muscle per unit volume, might have to take a backseat to more stimulus to fatigue ratio exercises. So for example, you may no longer do lots of deadlifting on a fat loss phase, lots of standing barbell overhead presses, but you might do more machine presses, more stiff-legged deadlifts, so on and so forth. Point number 3, progressing more slowly is almost always a good idea. What does that mean? First of all, as you make training harder and harder week after week, usually your maximum recovery volume will come down to you as fatigue accumulates in any phase. However, in a fat loss phase, remember, fatigue accumulates way, way fast. So your maximum recovery volume will come down quicker, which means if you accumulate as usual, really increasing loads or reps or even sets, what ends up happening is you run into your MRV much sooner. And then it's a situation where maybe you do 2 or 3 weeks of normal accumulation training and it's time for a deload. Because, and we'll get to this in the diet stuff, when you're deloading, you should be on maintenance calories, no fewer. Gee whiz, pushing it hard for 2 weeks and then going for a whole week on maintenance is kind of stupid. You want at least a 4-to-1 ratio, a 4-to-1 accumulation to deload paradigm. So you have 4 whole weeks of deficit dieting and then maybe just 1 week of maintaining. In order to make those 4 weeks or more work, here are some recommendations. Exercises which you would normally put, like, say, 10 pounds on per week, maybe you want to put 5 pounds on per week instead. If you're thinking, all this exercise was pretty easy last week, I think I'll add 2 reps, maybe just add 1 repetition. And of course, you use autoregulation, pump, burn, etc., to add sets, see how sore you are, see how you're recovered. But within that context, there's always a little bit of wiggle room where it's kind of a personal decision. Like, yeah, I could add like 1 set or 2 on a fat loss phase, err on the side of less. So if last week on a leg press, you didn't get super sore, you recovered super fast, but you got a little bit of a twinge, and it was 4 sets of leg press, this week go to 5, don't go to 6. If it's a massing phase, you go to 6, no big deal. You just eat your way out of that hole. On a fat loss phase, that crazy high amount of fatigue could spell some really not great things, especially for sustainability. Point number 4. Keep your training frequency a little bit higher than maybe normal or just high. What does that mean? At least 2 times per week per muscle. Probably 1 time per week per muscle is not a good idea because what happens normally is this. Let's say you're training at maintenance or a surplus. You train your pecs 1 time a week on Monday. They grow for the next several days and probably by Thursday they're done growing. And then normally they just kind of sit around. They don't really lose any of their size and they recover really, really profoundly. They recover from all the microtrauma. Their nervous system recovers, that innervates the pecs. And then if you train them again next Monday, yeah, you could have trained them more often and gotten a little bit more growth, but you're so recovered that every workout, every next Monday is amazing because you're like overly healed. Here's the problem. On a fat loss phase, you train pecs on Monday. By Thursday, they're done growing, which is to say they probably put on as much muscle mass as they lost during that time. So they're done being the same size. Muscle conservation has occurred. Friday, Saturday, Sunday, you're in a deficit, so you're probably not recovering nearly as much as you should be, and you're in a deficit without any stimulus from the muscle itself, from training, that tells the muscle to stick around. There's no anabolic drive, so the net anabolic-catabolic ratio shifts to muscle loss potentially. A little bit of muscle loss, but nonetheless something there. So not only is training once a week on a fat loss phase no longer get you that super healing factor, it also might lose you a little bit of muscle, just a bit every week. But look, 12 weeks later, that's maybe significant. So a better idea, split up your volume. Let's say you do, 15 sets on, or 16 sets total for chest on a Monday, and then next Monday you do 16 again. Take 8 sets, put it Monday, Thursday. That way you get an anabolic boost. And then by the time that sort of goes away, you're more or less training again, and you're always getting this consistent anti-catabolic, anti-muscle loss messaging. That's probably a good idea for muscles that heal really fast, rear delts, side delts, biceps. For some people, calves, maybe 3 or 4 times a week is an even better idea, because even 2 might not be optimal, right? Again, if you go to a higher frequency situation, don't just add in days and not change the volume. Again, when the chest example, it was 16 sets Monday. Take 8 sets off of that, put it on Thursday. Don't go like, oh yeah, higher frequency, 16 Monday, 16 Thursday, because that'll exceed your maximum recoverable volume for the week. You're just going to eat shit in 2 or 3 weeks. Point number 5, really keep tabs on your fatigue and deload when needed. If your performance on most of your muscle groups starts to backslide, right, it hits a peak and then it goes back down, don't be like, yeah, I'm just cutting, whatever. Take a deload, and yes, maintenance calories only on a deload to allow that recovery. If you have a fat loss diet, a deficit during a deload, what are you doing? Because here's the thing, the deload is supposed to save muscle mass, spare it, and also you're supposed to reduce fatigue. What is the effect of low calories on fatigue reduction? Terrible. What is the effect of low calories on muscle sparing? Reverse. So if you diet through a deload, you're really shooting yourself in the foot. And I know it sucks. A whole week or half a week of deloading is time you're not losing fat, for sure. But think of it this way. You're priming yourself for another 4 weeks of awesome fat loss, great training. If you skip the deload, or if you just diet right through the deload, you're going to make it another 2 or 3 weeks, and then you're going to be in shambles. And then you'll have to deload unless you want performance really to start falling and you're losing a lot of muscle. Proper fat loss dieting requires pushing into the darkness of a deficit and then coming back out. Pushing in and coming back out. It's not pushing all the time. If you want it to be, your training and muscle retention will not be optimized. Lastly, in between burps of mine, you have to fight to make small PRs, or at least try. Pure autoregulation, which is when you come into the gym, you don't look at your logbook, you go, okay, 2 reps in reserve today, and you hit it and you're like, oh, I think that's 2, and you stop. On a massing phase, it might actually work okay, because you're just naturally getting bigger and stronger anyway, and with minimum willpower, you'll just be like, oh, 2 RIR, oh cool, I hit a PR, sweet. Pure autoregulation is not the best idea, especially on a cut, because psychologically, you may be so tired, so exhausted, so unmotivated because you have so few calories that even if physiologically, if you're able to hit a PR, you might not, because you're like, ugh, it's just a ton of systemic fatigue. So what you have to do is check this. What is it that I hit last week? What numbers, what sets, reps, and weight? This week, I'm going to try to hit at least the same thing, maybe putting 5 pounds on everything and not reducing my reps, maybe keeping all the weight the same, but increasing a rep here and there. If you can push to make those PRs, yeah, it might cause you a lot of relative effort, but then you can always deload if your fatigue gets too high. The other problem is if you sort of, I'm going to take training a little easier. It's those reps you miss or never get. It's those, today was tough, I'll just do sets of 8 on the squat. I think I maybe did 10 last week. You take away enough of those building blocks, enough of those stimulators, enough pushing closer to failure over the course of a diet, that can cost you muscle. You have to fight for your muscle, which means start with 3 reps in reserve, but push with a purpose until you can't push anymore. And remember, we're pushing not as hard, so we've already accounted for the fact that it's tougher. Maybe we put 5 pounds in the bar, maybe even 2.5 if 5 is too many. Maybe we add a rep here and there. Maybe we don't add a rep on all of our sets of, let's say we did 4 sets. Maybe we don't add a rep on all of them. Maybe we just add a rep on the first 2, or maybe just the last 2, something. At least tie and try to go above, because that way, when you eventually hit failure, you deload and repeat, you did everything you can, you really expended yourself, so that, there may be 99 reasons to lose muscle on a cut, but you not physically nutting up to train harder will not be one of them if you follow this method. Folks, give this some thought. Next time I see you, you had better be lean and not have lost any muscle. See you next time for the next video in this series.